So why do we get baptized, and is this essential for our salvation? Why are there certain commands in the Old Testament that we don't follow anymore? And why do we follow the things that we do? These are the things we're going to be answering today in our lesson. So a few weeks ago, Joshua sent 2 spies into Jericho to check out the land before they went into that area for battle. And when they got there, they encountered a prostitute whose name was Rahab. And she told them that all of the people on the western side of the Jordan had heard all of the things that God had done for his people. They knew how God had brought them out of Egypt by parting the Red Sea and letting them walk across on dry ground. They had heard how God had helped them defeat the Amorites on the eastern side of the Jordan, and everyone was afraid. Then last week, we talked about how they crossed the Jordan River on dry ground also. God stopped the flow of the Jordan River and allowed them to cross. So twice now, God has parted the waters for his people to walk across, and he's helped them defeat 2 of the Amorite kings on the eastern side of the Jordan. And there are also Amorites that are living on the western side of the Jordan, and then a whole bunch of other people, and they've heard all of these things, and these people are in their land. So if they weren't afraid before, they're very afraid now. So Joshua chapter 5 starts out by telling them how afraid the people are. And then God says, okay, now I need you to make yourselves ready. Here in a few days, you're going to begin your first battle. But first, I need you to renew your covenant with me by being circumcised. All of their fathers had been circumcised, but they failed to circumcise their sons when they were wandering around in the wilderness. And this is something that God had commanded for his people to do. Centuries before, whenever God went to Abraham and asked him to leave his land and go to this unknown place, he told him, I will make you into a great nation, and I will give that nation this land that I'm taking you to. And so Abraham set out for this place, and when he got there, God said, this is the land. And Abraham stayed in that land, and he raised his family there, even though he never owned one piece of that land except for the land that him and his family were buried on. That's the only piece of land that he actually bought. But he lived as a stranger on that land, knowing that God would eventually give this land to his family. The only problem is he had no children yet. And so him and his wife Sarah, after several years, decided, we're not having any kids. Sarah, maybe you're barren and maybe I can have children. And so they decided that Sarah was going to give her maidservant Hagar to Abraham, and he could have children through her. And they did this. And so Abraham was excited. He thought that this land was going to go to this son, Ishmael, to his descendants. But when Ishmael was 13 years old, God came to him and he said, this was never my plan. That was you and Sarah's plan. My plan was for you and Sarah to have a child together. At this time next year, I'm going to come back to you, and Sarah will have had a son. And through that son, who they name Isaac, the promise of this land is going to be through that son. And so this was God renewing his covenant with him, renewing the promise that he had made to him years ago. And when he renewed the promise this time, he said, now I want you to do something as a sign of this promise to me. What you're going to do is you and Ishmael and all of the men that are living in your household are going to be circumcised. And this is going to set you apart from all the rest of the people in this nation. And it is going to demonstrate your faith towards me. It's going to show everyone that you belong to me, and this will be your part of the covenant to me. And so Abraham does this, and this is supposed to happen with every generation following. But as I said, all of them did this up until this generation's dads. And then they just quit circumcising their sons while they were wandering around in the wilderness for these 40 years. And so these sons are about to inherit this nation that was promised to Abraham that they're standing in right now. And so God says, I use circumcision to distinguish Abraham from the rest of the people living here in this nation. And so I need all of you to be circumcised now so that you can distinguish yourselves and so that you can demonstrate your faith to me and show your allegiance to me. And so they're all circumcised immediately as soon as they get into this land. Now, this would take more faith for them to do than it did for their fathers because they just arrived in enemy territory, right? And now they're going to do surgery with no anesthesia and no modern ways of healing. And these men are going to take several days to heal. And so they have to trust God a lot to obey him in this. They must believe that he's actually going to keep them safe until they heal and then bring them victory in their first battle, or they wouldn't do it. So this is another act of faith on their part. Remember last week I said crossing the Jordan on dry ground was just their first act of faith, and that God was going to ask them to do this many, many more times. And so now they're having to trust that God's going to protect them in this land from all of the enemies while they're healing from this surgery. And so they do it. And then after they're all circumcised, God says, today I have rolled your shame away. They must have been in such a state of shame and desolation, right? The Egyptians must have been looking on them like, okay, so God rescued you from us to take you where? For you to get what? What was the purpose? You had Goshen as your land. Yes, you were our slaves, but you at least had food there and you had land there. God took you out of that place and you wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years with no food and no land of your own. So what was the point? And so they have been looking like a shamed nation. And God says, today I have rolled that shame away. Today you're no longer disgraced and in desolation. Instead, you are coming into this land honored and feared, and you will soon be victorious. God is changing the state of their nation today in this new generation. Yes, their fathers, they rejected this land. They did not trust God, and so they were disgraced and in a desolate land. But for this new generation, God is changing everything. They have a new status, right? So when God tells them that he's going to roll their shame away, they take this word roll and they decide to call the place that they're standing on, the place that they have been camping, Gilgal, which means roll. It's going to remind them that God rolled our shame away in this place when we entered this land. And this is the place that they stacked those 12 stones that we talked about last week to remind themselves how God had brought them across the Jordan River. And then the actual spot that they're all circumcised, they call by a Hebrew name that I cannot pronounce, but it means the hill of the foreskins, which is absolutely gross, right? But they are all about remembering all of these things, right? And so when they see this hill, they'll remember that God rolled their shame away when they did these things. And when they see that stack of rocks, they're going to remember that God brought them across the Jordan River on dry ground and that they're there safely. And so this is a reminder of all that God has already done for them, all God is about to do for them, and of their renewed commitment to him.